Dr. Vibeke, thank you very much for making time for us for the Weird Sauce podcast, and welcome. Would you like to introduce yourself for the audience and to explain a little bit what you do and who you are?
Yes, thank you very much for having me. Well, I'm a Danish doctor, PhD, and have been, a doctor for, I think, within 34 years. And in all that period, most of the time, I really worked with epidemiology, public health, preventive medicine, and so on. And from the beginning, when they locked down, the whole Western world, but especially in Denmark, I spoke out the minute it came out because there was no reason for having the lockdowns. And I have kept being critical. And along that path, we have published some data. We are now four with the Swedish data, but four scientists, a statistician, a professor within cardiology, and me. And we have published this study about BATS-dependent safety issues with the Pfizer vaccine, the mRNA vaccine. And that has been along the way. So that has been part of just remembering really what being a good doctor is all about. That is to have the pros and the cons. And for some odd reason, the whole Western world forgot the cons. It was only the pros, and it was only a massive, intense you could call it a brainwash or whatever. But so I've been kind of a critical voice. But in my opinion, I've just been a good doctor, really. I've just been, remembering the Hippocratic oath, remembering what are your purpose as a good doctor. So, and a scientist, of course.
A very interesting way to put it. So, yeah, if you would give us some more context into the differential that happened in terms of dealing with a pandemic, which we have to assume every one of these countries in Europe had plans before, and what happened in Denmark specifically compared to the likes of the rest of the EU or Sweden or other countries where plans were possibly have been in place before that, because we had SARS-1, we had other pandemic before. So explain to us the differential and what alerted you to something quite out of a place to some extent given COVID.
Well, as I said before, I've been into this field for literally almost 34 years, actually more or less the whole of my medical career, and been there also when we have had like the bird influenza and all that. And there's a very important thing here, because the difference between Denmark and Sweden was that Denmark from the government was very governmentally they were actually pulling the strings, and they were actually telling what to do and not to do. But if you look into the laws, just before that this came on, you call it a pandemic, and what is a pandemic? But nevertheless, when we had the issue, the corona issue, they actually changed the law, because beforehand, as when we had like the bird influenza and so on, in the law it said that the government had to listen to the experts, the health authorities. So they were actually the ones telling, we know this and that, and we have to be very for this and that, and we're going to do this and that, based on evidence, based on knowledge, based on, experiences from early on and so on. But they changed that in Denmark. So it was actually like an advice, but nothing really they did have to listen to, which obviously Mette Frederiksen, the Danish prime minister, didn't listen to. She just, because actually the director at that time of the Danish Health Authority actually said exactly the same as I did, that there was no need for having the lockdowns, that it was out of proportionality, and that it would do much more harm than good, and so on. But she choose not to listen. She copied very much the way of doing it in the States. But on the opposite, when you look into Sweden, they still had the same law. So they were actually, the Swedish politicians were actually, they couldn't navigate around, they couldn't bypass the health authorities in Sweden. So they had to listen to the experts. And they did it much more wiser, because they had the knowledge, they had the insight, they knew the science and so on. So that was much more, literally common sense within the field, common sense out from what we knew from data, what we knew. We already knew at that point that there was a seasonal fluctuation. I mean, we knew a lot about COVID-19 already. So, and we knew a lot about the very, very small numbers in Denmark when they locked down and closed down the whole country. We hardly had anyone with corona. I mean, it was literally just crazy. So, but you have to understand that they actually in Denmark changed the law. So actually, you could say that Mette Frederiksen pulled the power back to herself, or took the power back, or even stole the power back. You could see, because that has been my um, critique all along the way, that they didn't listen to the experts. It was like someone said, "What do I think here?" And then from then on, they kind of felt, what they should think, and looked very much into the states. And for me, they very obvious had a big wish, and that was the wish of maintaining power. So they couldn't care about the rights of the people, about the science, about common sense. It was like maniac, greediness for power, as I see it. And as I also, think very, very close to what we have seen, like in communist countries in the Eastern Europe, and for me even worse, because when you look into the rights of the people, they just neglected that. I mean, just the idea of locking down a country, in a democracy on that basis is literally, when you look at it the scientifically and out of the data, pure, pure insanity.
And so the follow on to this is, so they locked down, by they I mean Denmark, locks down Europe, locked down lots of country, locked down almost in synchrony. So I've talked to other people who were in the U.S., and they've noted, all of them have noted, that very odd sense of synchrony that we never had before in healthcare for other things. So you note this, and then what happened in terms of after this? So what happened in terms of the introduction of the countermeasures that the government then suggests? Do they allow for treatment? Do they allow for doctors to go about do what doctors do, which is to interfere with their patient, and to just the relationship between patient and doctor is intact or not? And then when does the vaccine comes in? What vaccine were there, and what happens to Denmark at that point?
Well, the thing is, they were, as you said, they were copying the American way of doing it. It was very obvious that there was kind of a pattern. You can see that also of the harassment of critical doctors. I just realized a year ago, actually, that, all the harassment against doctors, as myself and others around the world, has gone like, literally has had the same recipe. It's like they have kind of ordered what to do and not to do. You tend to think, oh, that's only me, and that's me who's done something wrong. And it turns out to be, orchestrated, literally almost by the line. But what they did in Denmark was that they kept on going with, the fear mongering. You are not allowed to think critically. You were not even allowed to have the discussion critically. When I expected, because I'm a public figure in Denmark and has been for 30 odd years. I've written 35 books about rearing children, and I'm a public figure. And I before Corona, they were very often listened to my opinions and my knowledge about this and that. And if there was a new study, I would comment on that, and so on. And literally on the date, they closed down the microphone for me, so to speak. From that on, I was just, defamated, making fun of, and harassed, and in so many ways. And from that on, you are not allowed to have any critical views, not from the doctors, from the public or anyone. You're just supposed to, walk in line, literally, as we saw maybe in the Nazis' time, literally, because you're not supposed. The minute you had a critical, note, you were harassed, you were being, police would come and see if you had the mask on. It was so terrible what they did to us. And then in Denmark, it was mainly the Pfizer vaccine, which the government took home. And they started the vaccine rollout in very end of December 2020. They started literally 21, but the end of December 20. And what happened at that time was that we just had that one small study from Pfizer, which I read the minute it came, and which actually showed that they tried out the so-called vaccine or mRNA injection. They tried that out, on a double-blind project, but it was like mainly younger people, fresh people, without any chronic diseases or anything. They only followed them for a very, very short period of time, and they kind of showed there could be a response on that. But literally, if you go and look at what you usually have of safety measures and what you have to have of projects of this and that before you have medicine coming on the market, this was like, I have a lot of knowledge about how you develop medicine. I've been a part of the Orphan Drug Act when you had to find medicine for rare diseases and so on. And usually it's a big thing going on, and you have to have all these projects and studies and safety issues and all that. And so suddenly within few months, that, little study, which in many ways you could criticize, bang, you would have a vaccine roll on out for the whole population. And then again, you would think as a doctor, well, hang on. At that point, we already knew that we had the natural immunity. We already knew that natural immunity would protect, a long way for the people who have had corona at that time, which many already had. And we knew that young people didn't really get affected with corona. We also knew that if they got affected, it was like a little sneeze or something. They were never being harmed. They weren't threatened by death or hospitalization and all that. So it was like, what's going on? We are now a year along the corona scam, so to speak. We know already that it hasn't, at least in Denmark, been the big killer. We didn't have any excess mortality, nothing whatsoever. And it was a small percentage of all the hospitalization, which in Denmark, which were related. So it was like literally, why this big fuss when we already know that there's nothing really to worry about at this point? So, I was then again, well, maybe some chronicle, very sick, like if with the influenza vaccine, maybe there could be a point, but why vaccinate the young ones and even more the children, the pregnant women? That was crazy. Usually when we have pregnant women being treated with medicine, we're very much aware of, can it harm the child, as we saw with the thalidomide? Can it harm the mother, and so on? And I was like, what's going on? And then one of the other lies started, because they said from the government, from the health authorities, well, this will stop transmission. And I was like, where did that come from? We don't have any data showing that. EMA, who gave the emergency authorization, never had it. Yeah, never had anything about the transmission. Where did that lie come from? And when you see and you realize, well, I realized that already, but when you kind of realize again, this is a big scam. I mean, they forgot, what good, medical art is, or doctor art, or whatever you call it, what's going on. And then we were looking at the numbers because we, a statistician and I, had been following from the lockdown start the number of deaths, the number of hospitalization. We have been looking into the data on a daily basis. And then we kept looking on a daily basis on the death rates and so on. And very shortly, we could see, especially among the elderly, that when the vaccine rollout started, that, more people died within the first 2 weeks. And we couldn't, of course, say, well, that's because, but when you look into the data and you recognize a pattern and you suddenly see, like, literally like that, it changes, then it's like, what could that be? And then the next thing was that we kept looking at the data. And May 21, and that's the big, you know, that should be a day or a month or with flags on half, so to speak. Then the excess mortality started. And since May 21 in Denmark, and it turns out in many other Western countries, we have had excess mortality. And when that started and didn't come back, then we kind of thought, what's going on? Because I said from the start with the lockdowns that this would cost lives. Because when you lock down a health system, the hospitals, the GPs, and so on, you will have a delayed a delayed diagnosis, treatment, rehab, operations, surgeries, and so on. So I expected that the lockdowns, that there would be a follow-up of excess mortality because of the lockdowns. But this came like literally on a date. So it couldn't be by itself the lockdowns and the delayed, diagnosis, and within that, earlier death and so on from cancer and heart diseases. So at that time, or around that time, Max, who is the statistician in our study, and we got in contact because they had already started from the VERS data to kind of show a pattern where there was like a different batch dependency with the side effects. And then we started out to ask for the data. At that point, we could have data, which they have denied us later on. But then we got all the data, and Max looked into the trends and so on. And eventually, in a year ago, and that's in 23, eventually we managed to have it published in European Journal of Clinical Investigation with peer review. And it took us about 7 or 8 months from when we uploaded it first time until it was published. The first journal who took it into peer review also published the study, but beforehand, we got through New England Journal of Medicine. They couldn't care less. The Lancet, JAMA, Archives of Internal Medicine. I mean, we were around the big ones, and they literally denied us any peer review or anything. They just didn't want to hear any critical voices being raised concerning the vaccines, the mRNA injections. And I think that's very worrying because, again, I would expect as a peer, that my colleagues, which often are the chief editors or editors at least, and so on, that they would have that open mind, because my attitude, so to speak, or my way of going to the data has all the time been, well, if it shows the opposite, that's still interesting. At one point, when we had the excess mortality, my statistician said, well, Vibeke, what if it shows the opposite? Well, I say, well, if it's going to show, then we're going to be thankful, grateful, and then that's what we're going to publish. I mean, you need to have an open mind, and that seems like some of my colleagues just lost that open mind because we kept the open mind. And we have just replicated our data in Sweden and finds exactly the same pattern, which is that some batches gave more side effects
Yeah, so
than
we'll
others.
we'll talk about this in details, but just for context, so that again, it's situating for people. Did they actually mandate the vaccines, or was that a sort of heavy-handed push? Were there mandates and for that?
Well, you could say indirectly there was a mandate because they had this vaccine passport, which made it very difficult for the non-vaccinated people. So they also put a lot of pressure on the health professionals, and some was even fired for not being vaccinated. But it's not like they couldn't do it by law, but they would come and say, are you not vaccinated? And someone was told to stay back home because they weren't vaccinated, and someone was even fired. But it was a mandate directly. If you wasn't vaccinated, then you would have to go and be tested all the time if you were going to go out somewhere public, which was literally, harassing unvaccinated. And the Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, was really harassing and smeared the unvaxxed public. She would stand and say that, it was disgraceful, and, that they were the reason why everyone else was sick. And, it was almost coming to that point that you felt maybe someone will turn against the unvaccinated because they were being so much harassed and defamated and smeared. So you kind of, in the end, there was a period of time where I thought maybe someone will turn into violence against the unvaccinated because her nudging, her fear mongering, her harassment of the public was so extreme.
Right.
So you could say it was an indirectly mandate.
Yeah.
And which also turns out, I think we are one of the most vaccinated, mRNA vaccinated public in the Western Europe. We are more than 90% of the adults, 18 has got at least one vaccine, which is crazy.
Well, I mean, Japan, as we're recording this, Japan. So now we're obviously in 2024, and for the first quarter of 2024. So we have a lot more data from a lot of other countries outside Europe, in addition to the United States. And Japan, for example, who I was shocked to hear that had up to 7 shots. It's really incredible. Is showing a lot
And
of
still
side effects and a lot of morbidity in the
And
population.
exactly. And they had that very interesting study the other day from Curious about
Yes,
the cancer mortality, and
yes,
that's a Japanese study. And I was also shocked to hear that they have had the seventh shot. But
yeah,
that's interesting because in Denmark it's just poof disappeared.
disappear.
You
Yeah.
know,
So before we go into the rest of the question that I have around how come you saw certain patterns that other people didn't, and then you dig further, and then you resisted pressure to agree to the general findings. So before we go into that, I would like to go back to the study itself, because I think a lot of people, as you said, you alluded to the fact that peer review is a very broken process. I think COVID really unraveled that. I think a lot of people had talked about it before. We have, John Ioannidis in Stanford had published this replication catastrophe that a lot of the science were into. What I wasn't too aware of is how cartelized, so to speak, the higher ed scientific publications actually are, like the Lancet. And we saw with the Lancet Commission scandal and the Sergi Fear scandal, and the fact that a lot of these things never got retracted. So we sort of stumble upon crisis after crisis that this kind of domino effect of COVID actually did. So I want to go back to the actual study, because when I read it and when I listened to you on other podcasts about a year back, my jaw really literally dropped, in the sense that you would have thought in other times that this would have been the headlines in all mainstream media, analyzed, question that other scientists would have joined in, would have asked you for data, would have. So explain to us exactly what the study showed and how is that really stupefying.
Well, I would have expected exactly the same. It was like, as my husband said, it's like you find the solution for cancer. Well, this wasn't a solution, but still you find something which is very, very important for, public health all over the world. And literally everyone ignores it. And so that I would have expected the same if I didn't know beforehand how immense the censorship was. At that time, I already had a lot of knowledge about how immense censorship was, but still, and we have had the experiences with the Lancet and so on. But what it shows, and what I think is so worrying, is that it shows that the batches, and this is only on the Pfizer because that's in what we used in Denmark mainly, shows that the batches which were given in the beginning, and that was in Denmark, mainly to health professionals. People tend to say, well, that was the elderly. No, no, mainly it was the health professionals, but also elderly. But it showed that these so-called blue badges, I mean, it goes into three trends. You have one trend, and that is the badges given in the start, which has like many more, 1,000-fold more side effects reported than the yellow badges which were the badges being given, later on in the vaccine rollout. And some of the badges and boosters even more, don't have even one reported side effect, which kind of made us call it, we doesn't do that in the article, of course, but kind of call it the saline, because what happened along the way. And I think, again, being a doctor and having been in the field for so many years, I would have expected that my colleagues at EMA or in the Danish Lægemiddelstyrelse would have kind of said, oh, this is varying. We have a batch-dependent issue. That's why we have the safety signals. That's why we have these collection of the side effects. Oh, we must do something. But instead, they just ignored this finding. They tried to kind of say, no, that can't be right, or they did it wrong, or no. They have actually later on confirmed that our findings were right, because they did a small kind of replication themselves. But so the varying part was that you did have, or you does have a product where it depends on which batch you get, whether you will have side effects. And in any other case, you would withdraw that product on the minute. When you have such a big batch issue, whether that is food, medicine, whatever it is, the minute you realize that something is going on, you would say, hey, hold it for a second, withdraw it, and try and find out what's the reason for that. But they kind of ignored it, tried not to listen, and so on. So it actually shows that until late March 21, that was the blue badges being given, and as I said, mainly to health professionals. And then for the green badges, there was still side effects being reported, but in a much lesser account. And then the yellow badges, which were given later on, hardly, if any, being reported. And that shows a pattern which, because lots of people will say, well, what's the reason? Is there causality? Well, of course there's a causality. I mean, if you have like something which should be the same product, and it's more or less the same people you are vaccinating, because people get another vaccine and so on. So if there's such a huge difference, why have a database? Why have a safety database if you don't look into it and if you don't react to it? And so I think there's a causality, that's for sure, without doubt. But whether they changed the product along the way, whether it was the transportation, the storage, the administration, or all four, I don't know. But what is interesting also is that when we had the study out, we were very much interested in how would Pfizer react, because if I was Pfizer, I would be, oh my God, what's going on? They reacted with silence. And that's because Pfizer knew this already. Actually, going back to August 21, they themselves informed EMA. We have that also, the publication of it. They informed EMA that some of the badges, which is mainly the blue badges, some of the badges they mentioned we haven't used in Denmark, but that they gave many more side effects than others. So think about that. August 21, EMA was informed by Pfizer themselves, and they didn't do anything. We confirmed that, really, and now we have reconfirmed it in Swedish data. And what I also think is varying, which we didn't look so much into in the Danish data, because we were more keen on the pattern and what's going on. But what we can tell now from Denmark and from Sweden and also from Danish data is that there's also a big sex difference. So in Sweden, 75% of the patients or people, public, which has had reported side effects are women. How can you have a product where 75% of reported side effects are women? Which I would say that shows, is it dangerous for women? And what it also shows in Sweden is that in Sweden, we have it also in Denmark, but in Sweden it's even worse, an extreme underreporting from health professionals. And when you look into data in Sweden, usually about 95% of reports of side effects in the database will be from health professionals, mainly doctors. In this case, with the mRNA vaccine, it's only 15% which are from health professionals, which shows that there's an extreme underreporting and then lack of responsibility, you could say, from the professionals. And that, of course, we don't have an explanation apart from, again, this repression, that there's been like a global repression of critical voices. You are not supposed to talk about the side effects. You are only supposed to talk about the benefits. And that makes a repression. So the doctor who sits there has, of course, also been manipulated, brainwashed, and so on. So if a patient kind of had a side effects, I mean, this is just me thinking, of course, we haven't shown that. But I would expect that if that is your attitude, then you're not willing to report the side effects, and you may even be afraid that someone will, you know, harass you or criticize you from authorities if you report the side effects. So it has actually kind of diluted or kind of um, uh, what to say. Made it worse for the patients with side effects, but because the case is that people having side effects are not only being ignored by authorities, but actually also, it seems, by their doctors for some odd reason. There could be other reasons for that, but there's an extreme under.
Right. So that's too. That too is a pattern that we've seen in many other countries, which is also a red flag because how would you be able to coordinate both the actual virus, the response to the virus in terms of the countermeasure, and then also the response to the response by your healthcare system? That's extremely strange, to say the least. Now, what is the situation of awareness that Denmark and you and the scientific community there have of Dr. McKernan on the DNA plasmid contamination that has been shown since, which has equally being met with pretty big silence from this from Pfizer, from certainly from Pfizer,
Yeah.
and from generally from government who in some cases did mandate those shots for their citizen. And the second thing is, did the government start talking about the origin of this virus at any moment, in specifically in context of gain of function research and what the NIAID was doing, and the fact that those shots were essentially, at least the Moderna ones, were in part at least IP'd alongside with NIH and NIAID, alongside with EcoHealth Alliance and the Wuhan Institute of Virology. So was that story talked about much in Denmark?
No, no. I mean, the same censorship has been all along the way. Now it's like they pretend we forget all about it. Let's move on, and they kind of hope that people forget the big scam and also how they were, abused by the government. Really. So no, it hasn't been. A little bit about the Wuhan, but very very little. No, and I think some of the reason is there's still a censorship. Our study hasn't been mentioned whatsoever in the Danish press, and still it has reach out all over the world. So imagine how that would have been if some from the mainstream media had taken that story, which they didn't. And that censorship is still going on, and not no one has talked about the DNA contamination. I mean, we have a little bit of that also, of course, because you need to kind of try to understand why is there such a big batch difference, and that could certainly be one of the explanations. So we are of course very much into that and interested in that part also. But it's like you have a parallel world, really. You have the the governments, you have the mainstream media, they have their parallel way of living, and then you have scientists being interested in the matter, public being interested in the matter, literally running alongside. But I from my colleagues, I can see that we gain a lot of respect. I mean, it's very difficult to call you, names any longer, and people don't do that any longer. Only the most imbecile ones. But so it kinds of, and that's why I think, even though that the all this many of the corona studies which were published were literally crazy stuff they published, and the usual way of having a critical way of thinking was just forgotten, even though it still does have a value that is peer reviewed. And from all I can see, our study was actually maybe the first peer reviewed study who actually managed to, stand still in the storm, so to speak, and wasn't retracted, touch wood and all that, because some of the studies were later retracted. So I think that kind of has opened the door, and you see now more and more critical studies, as the one from Japan also, being published with peer review. So I think it's important to keep on going with that, and kind of, focusing on data, focusing on facts, and then, slowly, I think that the world will open up. And at least I can see from my colleagues that more and more kind of taking it in, so to speak, and more can see that, as I say, the big scam, or all the lies and all that. But it's also very difficult to comprehend for people who have taken 2, 3, 4 vaccines, people who have vaccinated their own children, and now realizing that there could be a connection with excess mortality. There could be a connection with excess mortality within cancer. It's very heavy for people to realize that, and it's very painful, because people mainly took the vaccine because of the big pressure. Not that they were afraid of corona, at least not young people, but there was such a big pressure. They had stolen their rights. They were not allowed to go here, there, or travel without the vaccine passport. So they kind of had taking away some of their, main human rights, so to speak, and they just wanted their freedom back. And that's, of course, very painful to realize, 2, 3 years along the line, that you have actually, as it seems, got a higher risk of excess mortality. We discuss turbo cancer and so on. So I understand if people are afraid or worried, and I'm afraid to say they should be,
Hmm.
because from the data we see, and the excess mortality we're still having, and the very big decline of birth rates, one should be very
Yeah.
worried.
So that's the next thing. That's the next thing that I'd say reality brings its own receipt, right? So here we are. We're not in the first round of this, and now insurance company, particularly for countries where the most well and the most insured are those in the workforce. So we can see from data in the U.S. that the workforce is being pummeled, and as an enormous amount of excess morbidity and mortality. And within the morbidity, we're seeing different issues for different age category, and that is being seen also in the EU. And in Australia, but in the particular case of the UK, it's quite phenomenal that the ONS, the Official of National Statistics, has actually very recently changed the way that they calculate excess mortality. One would wonder why you would need to do this now. But nonetheless, the NHS and the healthcare system in many of the ultra vaccinated countries are showing excess morbidity and mortality. Now, the disease that they're showing are things that we didn't see right off the bat. What we saw right off the bat seemed to have been the first onslaught of death and injuries. So there was a lot of women fertility problem. There was a lot of clot. There was a lot of myocarditis, pericarditis, insult to the heart. And then gradually, and we saw sudden death, we continue to see sudden death in athletes and people who are generally not expected to die in their sleep. But now we've seen a new round with the SV40 promoter that we've shown to be present in some of these vaccines. Now we're seeing an onslaught of turbo cancer in population that is very, very young, very odd cancer that we haven't seen. And then the work that's coming next, which is even more frightening if those were not, is the prion diseases, which then essentially will take a lot longer to express, but is already showing. And the work of, another McKernan in Japan has shown that the prion issues is really something to worry about. So, what is your sense now on the date that we are of what is happening in excess morbidity and the perhaps the burden that this is going to put on healthcare, which is kind of a counterfactual. It's a tautology because they told us that they wanted people vaccinated so that we wouldn't burn the healthcare system, and now the healthcare system are going to have to be burned by people who are sick and dying of time they shouldn't be. So, what is the situation you're seeing now?
Well, also, as you remember, it was the health professionals who had the blue badges, which is even more worrying. Not that it's not worrying that whoever had it, but here it's like the main part of the ones who should be taking care of the people being sick and dying are actually the ones. Well, there's nothing to laugh about, but the irony is actually the one who had the bad badges or the blue badges. I'm kind of split, so to speak, because I wish that we could just leave it behind us, forget all about it, and pretend it never happened, and have a new prime minister, and learn out that what our rights are, and so on. But that's one part of me. But when I look into the data, when I look into the excess mortality, that Japanese study showing a higher mortality rate of certain cancers and so on, I'm very worried. We have one problem, and of course I also follow the ONS data and all that, but we have very much focus on Danish data, and that is a certain excess mortality, and they can't. I mean, they can change that in the public figure and where they put the line and so on, but they can really, because we know how many usually should die a day, and we have so many data. So in the end, it's more an academic discussion. Where will you put the line, whether it's excess mortality or that, but still you do have an excess mortality. And for me, it's like, what's the reason for that? Is that we because we don't have the cancer data in Denmark being released. They are always like 2 or 3 years along the line, so delayed. But we can look into the excess mortality. We can ask our colleagues. We can listen to the different also organizations, like in the UK, the British Heart Association has been very outspoken about the many more heart attacks and heart fatal events and so on. So I'm worried, and I'm following the same data, and I'm part of some of the groups also with Kernan. I'm like, I wish I was wrong. And from the minute, literally May 21, when we saw the excess mortality, I every day wish that it was wrong, or that it was just come back to normal. I'm very worried about the rapid decline in the birth rates. I'm very worried that I just heard the other day that there might be problems also with giving birth, and we're eager to look into whether there has been more miscarriages, more early births and so on. So I keep looking and waiting for these, data and proper data, so to speak, because also there's a lot of rumors going on. There's a lot of frightness going on. There's a lot of talking about this and that, and that's why I keep being very keen on and very focused on the data, and especially the difference if you have another trend, and where was it beforehand, and all that. So I would say I'm afraid to say I've never been in my 34 years as a doctor been so worried as I am now. I wish I wasn't. I'm usually a positive person, but I am very worried, and I think it's frightening. And I think it's frightening that people were pushed into it. I mean, at least then again, you have the pros and the cons. Let's say it was a lethal disease. Let's say that if they hadn't been vaccinated, they would all be lying death on the streets, within a second. Then you can kind of accept that there will be a side effect, so there will be a risk, in that matter. But this was like a common flu. This was like literally especially the young ones, it wouldn't do them any harm. And they gave, as I said before, they gave it, a big lie about the transmission part. There was never any proof, and we don't still have any proof that it did anything toward the transmission. And that makes it very upsetting. And that's why I think that some of the politicians, I mean, in Denmark, we have what they call rigsretssag, that you have to stand corrected, and you can actually end up in jail for having lied to the public, and I hope that we will get there someday, because it has been immense full lying to the public, and it couldn't be. It must have been with purpose. But that's not gonna help people, because in the end, you know that if you lose someone you care much for, or someone who's like a younger person, it's not enough. It's not a relief just that someone took the responsibility. You will still miss that one loved person for the rest of your life. So, I mean, the prices people are paying are very high. And at the same time, the ignorance are as high. And then again, we have these parallel worlds, which is like being a part of a sci-fi movie, really. Hard to understand from the knowledge you had before the Corona scam. Before Corona, if you ask me, I would say, well, of course we will have this as a public discussion. Of course we will have, against, pros and cons, and we would have a democratic discussion. But that they have taken away from us, that they have robbed us from and denied us because of the censorship.
Right. So to conclude this conversation, and we could go on for hours because there's so many dimensions
Yes.
to this, and it's still a moving piece. Sadly, as you said, we're not out of
Yeah.
it
No.
proper. I would like to for you to reflect and to share with people who are hearing you talking and understanding how fighting something is very hard, and some fights are we're not very sure how they're going to end up. So what are the lessons that you have drawn for yourself about this tremendous event that you have been through, and what would you share with people that you think would be helpful emotionally, psychologically, about what we've just gone through, and how that could help them going forward, because we don't know what's next.
Well, from my point of view, I have kind of stuck to, as I said, the Hippocratic oath. I'm very strongly believe in that if I, as a doctor, get some knowledge which will help either a patient or the public, I have to speak out. So that even before Corona, I felt that very strongly. And also I realized with Corona, what I have been doing for so many years, what are my skills? And my skills are exactly looking into data, the epidemiology, and having I'm able to read and understand and also analyze the scientific articles, of put it all together and kind of analyze it and say, okay, this is where we're gonna go, kind of. So for me, I have realized, so to speak, what I'm good at. At the same time, having been, paying a lot of on the private side, because they tried to take away my authorization, which they didn't manage. They tried to harass me in many ways, which they didn't manage to, in the end. So it's kind of been very costly on one point, and on the other side, I think it had given me a new network, because I know now people around the world, colleagues, which have been courageous, brave, who hasn't forgotten the Hippocratic oath. So also I have won, so to speak, a new network, which I just love, because I love discussing the data. I'm very curious to look into data. Whenever there's a new study or data, I'm like, oh, what's that? And as I said before, it was the opposite. I was also be interested in that, or the opposite of what I would expect it. So I think it's very important to stick to the democratic rules, to kind of also realize the immense censorship which there is in mainstream media, which there has been in the medical scientific world, and so on. So, but on the happy note, so to speak, or kind of what to tell people. First of all the people who has been brave, of course, who took their own personal choice and said no. I'm like, hooray! I mean, that's really, really brave done. But all apart from that, I think it's also important for all the people who got pushed into it and who felt the big pressure to say, that's life. Really, life is difficult. Life is dangerous. You can die out of it. Oh, here comes my husband. Here comes my husband. He's one of my he's one of my biggest fans. That's right. He's one of my biggest fans.
That's super helpful then.
That's very helpful, and that's the other part. You need to rely on your fans. I mean, and as my husband is my biggest fan, but you need to rely on good people around you. You need to trust in good people. You need to get your energy from good people and try and navigate, away from bad people, so to speak. And I want to say to all the vaccinated people, that we do some mistakes now and then, and we can't vary from now till our hearts stop beating, because you can vary about that. You can vary about smoking. You can vary about not wearing a helmet when you bicycle. You can vary all the time. So it's also important for me to say, we need to have this discussion. We need to have this focus, but we also need to live our lives while we still have our lives. So not to worry, at the same time to be aware about the big scam.
Great. And to conclude, I will ask you the question I ask all my guests on this podcast, aptly named Weird Sauce. So what's your weird sauce for life? What's your special ingredient that makes you who you are and gives you the strength to be fighting when you need to fight?
Well, you just heard him in the background. I'm so happy that my husband is also a colleague. He's actually a part of our team. He's a professor within cardiology, and as he said, he's my biggest fan. And I think I'm his also. And I think whenever I think life is tough and someone is rude, I have someone I can hang to, and someone who will say, "I love you for all what you are and what you're not." So I'm very grateful for that. And I think at the end of the day, that's what keeps me going.
That's a lovely note, especially coming from a cardiologist. Very good.
Exactly. I call him my heart's.
Yeah.
I call him my heart's professor.
Fantastic.
He's my heart's professor. So
that's a lovely metaphor. Dr. Vibeke, thank you so much for your work and the time you afforded us, and we wish you a good health going forwards, a good strength, and all the love and support you deserve, given how much you give.
And thank you, and thank you for having me, and same back to you, and for your excellent work yourself.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
If this conversation stopped you in your track, share it with your network. You never know whose life you might change for the better. Thank you for listening. Stay curious about our next guest, and stay curious about life.